Grady Nix had lost just about everything: his job, his savings, and any clear path forward for him and his daughter. At 53, driving toward his sister's place to ask for help he never wanted to need, he got a letter saying he'd inherited a cabin from an uncle he barely knew. The lawyer called it worthless, a shack on dry land in the middle of nowhere. But with nothing left to lose, Grady took a detour to see it. Standing in front of the broken-down place, he almost turned around. Then he stepped inside and pulled up a loose floorboard. What he found underneath changed everything. It raised questions about his uncle's past that someone never wanted answered. What was hidden there that was worth keeping secret for so long? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Grady Nix had been a long-haul trucker for 20 years before the company sent him the email. No phone call, no meeting. Just a subject line that read, "Workforce Restructuring," and 2 paragraphs explaining that his position had been eliminated effective immediately. 20 years of clean driving records, on-time deliveries, and sleeping in truck stop parking lots reduced to an automated message and a severance check that wouldn't last 3 months. He'd sat in the small apartment he shared with his daughter June, staring at the screen of his laptop, feeling the weight of 53 years settle onto his shoulders like cargo he couldn't unload. The world had a way of making a man feel obsolete right around the time he figured out how to live in it. June had been 14 when her mother left. No dramatic fight, no other man. Just a note on the kitchen counter that said she couldn't do this anymore. This, meaning motherhood, marriage, the small life they'd built in a 2-bedroom walk-up on the east side of Tulsa. Grady had come home from a 6-day haul to find his daughter sitting at the kitchen table with that note in her hand, her face blank as fresh paper. 3 years later, June still carried that blankness. She spoke when spoken to, did her homework without being asked, kept her room neat as a military bunk. But the girl who used to wait by the window for his truck to pull up, who used to run out and hug him before he could even kill the engine, that girl had disappeared the same day her mother did. Grady had tried everything he could think of. Therapy, which June sat through in polite silence. Special dinners at her favorite restaurants, where she ordered carefully and ate methodically. Weekend trips to the lake, the zoo, the science museum. She participated in all of it with the same quiet compliance, never complaining, never refusing, but never quite present either. The apartment had become a museum of their previous life. June's old drawing still hung on the refrigerator, yellowed at the edges. Her mother's coffee mug still sat in the cabinet, though neither of them had the heart to use it or throw it away. Grady's logbook sat on the counter, a record of miles driven, fuel purchased, deliveries completed. He'd started adding small notes in the margins about June. June got a B+ on her history paper. June asked about Mom today. Told her the truth that I don't know. June smiled at dinner, first time in 2 weeks. The logbook had become his way of holding on to something solid. Proof that he was still her father, still present, still trying. When the severance money started running thin, Grady had begun the humiliating process of job hunting. But the trucking industry had changed. Companies wanted younger drivers who could work for less. They wanted people comfortable with new routing software, electronic logs, GPS systems that tracked every mile and every minute. Grady could drive anything with wheels and an engine, but the interviews always ended the same way. "We'll be in touch." They never were. The bills had piled up with mathematical cruelty: rent, utilities, groceries, June's school supplies, the truck, his own rig that he'd bought 10 years ago, now sitting in a storage lot because he couldn't afford the insurance. Every week the stack of envelopes grew thicker, the numbers inside them more threatening. His sister Ellen had called 3 times in the past month. She lived in Oklahoma City, had a spare room, kept saying it was no imposition. "You and June can stay as long as you need, Grady. That's what family does." Each time she called, it got harder to say no. Each time his pride took another beating. Finally, on a Tuesday morning in late August, Grady had packed their belongings into his old pickup truck. Not much to show for 53 years. Clothes in garbage bags, dishes wrapped in newspaper, June's books in a cardboard box. The furniture came with the apartment. Everything else they were leaving behind. June had helped in that same quiet way she did everything now. Efficient, careful. Not a single complaint about leaving the only home she remembered, the school where she'd spent 3 years, the small bedroom where she'd cried herself to sleep more nights than Grady wanted to think about. They'd pulled out of the parking lot at dawn, the truck's engine coughing twice before settling into its familiar rumble. Grady had glanced at the rearview mirror, watching the building shrink behind them. June sat in the passenger seat, her backpack on her lap, staring out the window at nothing in particular. "You okay, Junebug?" he'd asked. An old nickname from when she was little. "I'm fine, Dad." Same answer she always gave. They'd been on the road for 2 hours when Grady remembered to check the mail he'd had forwarded to Ellen's address. There'd been a small pile waiting at the post office, mostly junk and final bills from places that hadn't gotten the memo he was gone. But one envelope stood out, official letterhead. Patterson and Associates, attorneys at law. Grady had pulled into a truck stop to read it, his coffee going cold in the cup holder. "Dear Mr. Nix," it began, "we are writing to inform you of the passing of your uncle, Silas Nix, on July 12th of this year. As you are his sole surviving blood relative, you have been named as beneficiary in his will." Grady had to think for a minute before he could even place the name. Uncle Silas, his father's brother, a man he'd met maybe 3 times as a kid, always briefly, always awkwardly. A stern-faced man who lived somewhere out west, never married, never visited, barely acknowledged at family gatherings. Grady remembered his father saying once that Silas had made his choices and lived with them, but nothing more specific than that. The letter continued. "Your uncle's estate consists primarily of a parcel of land and a residential structure located in Custer County, Oklahoma. We must inform you that the property is in significant disrepair and holds minimal market value. The land itself is rural and undeveloped. If you wish to claim the inheritance, please contact our office to arrange transfer of the deed. If you choose to decline, the property will be sold at auction and proceeds donated to charity per your uncle's instructions." Grady had read it twice, then handed it to June. She'd scanned it quickly, her expression unchanged. "Do you want it?" she asked. "Not sure what I'd want with a broken-down shack in the middle of nowhere," Grady had said. "Lawyer says it's basically worthless, but it's yours if you want it." He'd looked at his daughter then, really looked at her. She was watching him with those careful eyes, waiting for him to decide, ready to accept whatever he chose, always accommodating, always careful not to be a burden. "We're not that far from Custer County," he'd said slowly. "Probably add an hour or 2 to the drive. Want to take a look? Just to see?" For the first time in recent memory, June had shown a flicker of interest. Not excitement exactly, but something close to curiosity. "Sure. Why not?" So Grady had plugged the property address into his phone and taken the next exit west. The highway gave way to state routes, then county roads, the landscape flattening into endless prairie. Wheat fields stretched toward horizons that seemed to curve with the earth itself. Towns appeared and disappeared like mirages. Grain elevators, water towers, a gas station or 2. The kind of country people drove through on their way to somewhere else. The GPS had led them down a gravel road that turned to dirt after 2 miles. No houses visible in any direction. Just grassland, fence posts, and sky so big it made a man feel small. June had sat up straighter, her eyes tracking the emptiness outside her window. There, Grady had said, pointing ahead. The cabin stood alone on a slight rise, and even from a distance, Grady could see the lawyer hadn't been exaggerating. The structure leaned to one side like an old man favoring a bad hip. The roof sagged in the middle. The porch had collapsed at one end. Windows were either broken or missing entirely, dark squares that looked like missing teeth. Grady had pulled the truck to a stop about 50 yards out, killing the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. No traffic sounds, no neighbors, just wind moving through dry grass and the ticking of the truck's cooling engine. 10 cents might be generous, he'd said, trying for humor. June had already opened her door, stepping out into the heat. Grady had followed, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. The sun sat low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. The air smelled like dust and distance. They'd approached slowly, Grady in front, June a few steps behind. The cabin was worse up close. Boards had warped and split. The door hung crooked on one hinge. Something had nested in the eaves. Birds or bats, he couldn't tell which. "Stay close," Grady had said, though he wasn't sure what danger he was warning against. The place looked more likely to fall down than cause any real harm. June had nodded, her hand reaching out to touch a weathered post. Someone lived here. Uncle Silas, apparently. No, I mean really lived here. Look. She'd pointed to small details Grady had missed, a hand-carved hook on the wall. Stones arranged along the foundation, decorative but purposeful. A coffee can nailed to a beam, rusted but still holding a few old tools. She was right. This wasn't just shelter. Someone had made a life here, however small and solitary. Grady had tested the first step onto the porch, his weight making the wood groan but hold. The second step cracked under his boot, but didn't give way. He'd reached back for June's hand, pulling her up beside him. The front door opened with a push, swinging inward on that one good hinge. The interior was dim, evening light filtering through the gaps in the walls. Grady had expected the smell of decay, but instead it was just dry dust and old wood. Clean in its own way. A single room, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, a table and one chair. A cot against the far wall, the mattress long since gone. Shelves built into the wall, empty now except for mouse droppings and spider webs. Evidence of a life stripped down to essentials. Grady had stood in the center of the room, trying to imagine his uncle here, eating alone at that table, sleeping on that cot, watching sunsets through these broken windows. What kind of man chose this kind of isolation? He'd started to turn, ready to tell June they'd seen enough, when his boot hit a floorboard that sounded different from the others. Not the solid thunk of wood on packed earth, but something hollow. Grady had knelt, running his fingers along the board. It was warped worse than its neighbors, the nails rusted and loose. He'd pried at it experimentally, and it lifted easier than it should have. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth and secured with duct tape, was a metal box. June had appeared at his shoulder so quietly he startled. "What is it?" Not sure yet. Grady had lifted the box free from its hiding place. It was heavier than expected, the metal rusted at the corners but still solid. The oilcloth had protected it from moisture, from time. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to keep this safe. He'd set it on the table, brushing away 40 years of dust. No markings on the outside, no label or explanation. Just a box with a small padlock holding the latch closed, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. "Why hide a box under the floor?" June asked, her voice carrying actual curiosity for the first time in longer than Grady could remember. "Good question." He'd tried the lock, knowing it wouldn't open but needing to try anyway. The shackle didn't budge. The whole mechanism had rusted into place. Whatever was inside had been locked away for a very long time. Grady had picked up the box again, gauging its weight. Not just papers, something with substance. Not heavy enough to be gold bars or anything dramatic, but enough to matter. "Should we open it?" June asked. "Not here. Don't have the right tools." He'd glanced around the cabin again, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. The windows offered clear views in every direction, but that meant anyone out there had a clear view in. The feeling settled over him like a change in air pressure before a storm. "Dad?" June's voice had an edge to it. "What?" "There's someone watching us." Grady's instincts kicked in before conscious thought. He'd stepped to the window, staying to the side, and looked out. At first he saw nothing but prairie and fading light. Then movement caught his eye. A vehicle about a quarter-mile out, parked on a rise where the dirt road crested. Dark truck or SUV, hard to tell in the dimness. Just sitting there. No headlights. "How long's it been there?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. "I don't know. I just noticed it. Could be someone curious about activity at the old cabin. Could be someone who'd been waiting for someone to finally come claim this place. Could be nothing at all. But Grady had learned to trust the feeling in his gut, and his gut said this wasn't nothing. "We're leaving," he said. He'd picked up the box, wrapping it back in the oilcloth more carefully this time. June had already moved to the door, her survival instincts sharper than any 14-year-old's should be. She'd learned early that when Dad said, "Move," you moved. They'd crossed the porch quickly, Grady testing each step before putting his full weight down. The truck on the rise hadn't moved, but he could feel a tension on them like heat from a spotlight. June had reached their pickup first, climbing into the passenger seat while Grady secured the box behind the seat, covering it with an old tarp. He'd started the engine, resisting the urge to gun it. Slow and steady, just folks finishing a look at an inherited property. Nothing to see here. The dirt road forced him to drive past the rise where the other vehicle sat. As they approached, Grady could make out two figures in the cab, faces indistinct in the gathering dark. The truck didn't move as they passed, didn't follow, just watched them go. June had stayed quiet until they reached the paved county road, then let out a breath she'd been holding. That was weird, right? Not just me being paranoid? Not just you, Grady confirmed. Question is, what were they watching for? He'd driven in silence for another 10 miles before pulling into a motel just off the highway. The Starlight Motor Court, a horseshoe of rooms around a parking lot. Each door painted a different shade of faded pastel. The neon vacancy sign buzzed and flickered. $39 a night, the clerk said. Grady had counted out 2 20s from his dwindling cash, took the key to room 7, and parked the truck directly in front of the door where he could see it through the window. Inside, the room smelled like disinfectant and old carpet. 2 double beds with floral bedspreads, a television bolted to a dresser, a bathroom with a rust-stained tub, but it was clean enough, and the lock on the door worked, and that was all Grady needed right now. He'd set the box on the table by the window, then retrieved his toolbox from the truck. June had perched on the edge of one bed, her backpack beside her, but her attention fixed completely on the metal container. "You think there's money in there?" she asked. "Maybe, maybe nothing. Only one way to find out." Grady had selected a screwdriver and a pair of pliers, working carefully to pry the rusted lock mechanism free. The metal resisted, then gave way suddenly with a snap. The lock fell to the table, and Grady lifted the lid. The smell hit him first. Old paper, metal, the particular mustiness of things sealed away from air and light for decades. Inside, the contents had been packed carefully, wrapped in plastic bags, separated with cardboard dividers. Cash, banded stacks of 20s, 50s, and 100s. Old bills, some dating back to the 70s if Grady was reading the designs right. He'd lifted them out carefully, counting. $7,300. Holy shit, June breathed, then caught herself. "Sorry. It's okay. I was thinking the same thing." Grady had set the money aside and reached for the next layer. Photographs, dozens of them, some in color but most in black and white. He'd spread them across the bed, and June had moved closer to look. The photos showed a younger version of Uncle Silas. Dark hair instead of the white Grady vaguely remembered, fewer lines in his face, but the same stern expression. In most of the photos he stood with other men, all of them dressed in work clothes, hard hats, coveralls, safety vests. Some showed industrial sites, machinery, scaffolding, storage tanks. Grady had flipped one photo over. On the back in faded pencil, Site 7, March 1978. Another photo showed Silas with his arm around a woman Grady didn't recognize. She was smiling, dark curly hair, maybe 30 years old. On the back, Sarah, 1977. "Who are all these people?" June asked. "Don't know, but your great-uncle knew them." Grady had continued sorting. More photos of work sites, more names and dates he didn't recognize. Then something different. A photo of Silas alone, standing in front of the cabin they'd just left. Only in this picture it looked new. Fresh paint, straight walls, no sag to the roof. The date on the back, August 1978. Grady had pulled out the remaining contents. Documents, mostly. Old papers with official-looking letterheads. Hartwell Energy Corporation. Oklahoma Department of Labor. Land deeds with legal descriptions he couldn't parse. Receipts from the late 70s and early 80s. Lumber purchases, building supplies, all paid in cash. One document stood out. A cashier's check made out to Silas Nix for $15,000, dated August 15th, 1978. No explanation, just the amount and the date. The issuing bank was listed as First National of Oklahoma City, and the memo line was blank. June had picked up one of the photos, showing a large group of men in front of what looked like a chemical plant or refinery. "Dad, look at this one." Grady had studied it. 24 men arranged in 3 rows, most of them looking straight at the camera. Silas stood in the back row off to one side, his expression even more guarded than usual. The photo had that official quality of a company picture, documentation of a crew or team. On the back, Site 7 crew, April 1978. Grady had sat down on the bed, spreading everything out to see it all at once. The money, the photographs, the documents, the dates clustering around 1978, the cashier's check, the land deeds showing Silas had bought this property in late summer of that same year. "This isn't just random stuff someone hid away," June said quietly. "This is important. This is something someone needed to keep safe." Yeah. Grady had picked up the cashier's check again, studying it. Question is, why? And who else knows it's out there? He'd thought about the truck on the rise, the figures watching them leave, the way they'd been waiting, like they knew someone would come eventually. June had gathered the photographs back into a stack, handling them carefully. The lawyer said Uncle Silas just died in July. That was only 6 weeks ago. So maybe those people tonight were waiting for whoever inherited this place. Waiting to see if they'd find what we just found. Grady had moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to check the parking lot. Their truck sat undisturbed. The highway beyond was quiet except for the occasional passing semi. But June's logic was sound, and it settled in his chest like a stone. "We should have just left the box where it was," he said. Too late now. June had already begun repacking everything carefully, the way Grady had taught her to. Secure loads. Everything in its place, nothing rattling loose. Besides, don't you want to know what this all means? He did. That was the problem. He absolutely did. Outside, night had fallen complete and heavy. Somewhere out in that darkness, maybe on a rise overlooking a broken cabin, someone might be wondering what Grady Nix had just taken from his uncle's hiding place, wondering what he'd do with it, wondering if he understood what he was holding. Grady had locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle for good measure, and settled in to figure out exactly what inheritance he'd just claimed. Grady had slept poorly, waking at every sound from the parking lot, his mind cycling through possibilities, none of which led anywhere good. By the time dawn broke, he'd counted the ceiling tiles twice and memorized the water stain pattern above the bathroom door. June was already awake when he emerged from the shower, the contents of the box spread across the small table in careful arrangements. She'd organized everything while he'd been tossing and turning, photographs in chronological order, documents sorted by type, the money counted and rebanded. 7,300, she confirmed. The bills are old, but they're still good. I looked it up on my phone. Grady had poured coffee from the pot he'd made using the room's ancient machine, the brew barely deserving the name but hot and caffeinated. That money's more than we had yesterday. It'll get us to Aunt Ellen's. Cover first month's expenses while you find work. She was right, practical as always. The money solved their immediate problem. They could stop at a bank in Oklahoma City, deposit it, keep moving forward. The inheritance had turned out to be worth something after all, even if just a temporary bridge to stability. But Grady kept looking at the photographs spread across the table, Silas's face appearing again and again, the dates clustering around that single year, 1978, the cashier's check for $15,000, the fact that someone had been watching the cabin last night. Coffee? He offered June. She'd wrinkled her nose. That stuff's terrible, Dad. It is, he'd agreed, drinking it anyway. But it's coffee. June had picked up one of the photographs. Silas with a group of men, all of them wearing hard hats with Hartwell Energy printed on them. I was thinking about this while you were sleeping, or not sleeping. You could hear me. The walls are thin, and you snore when you're stressed. She'd tapped the photo. All these pictures, they're from work. Construction sites, industrial places. Uncle Silas had a job, probably for this Hartwell Energy Company. Seems like. And then in August 1978, he gets a check for $15,000. That's a lot of money for the 70s, right? Grady had done the math in his head. Equivalent to maybe 60, 70,000 today. Yeah, that's significant. And right after getting that money, he buys land and builds a cabin in the middle of nowhere. June had lined up several photos in sequence. The work sites, then Silas in front of the new cabin, then later photos of him alone. It's like he disappeared. Went from working on big projects with lots of people to living by himself on empty prairie. She was connecting dots Grady had seen but hadn't quite assembled. His daughter might be quiet, but she wasn't missing anything. People change careers, he'd said, though even to himself it sounded weak. Not like that, not all at once. She'd picked up another photo, studying it closely. Look at his face in these work pictures. He looks normal. Maybe not happy, but normal. Then look at these later ones. Grady had compared them. She was right. In the earlier photos, Silas looked like any working man, serious, focused, but part of the world. In the later photos, after the cabin, his expression had shifted to something harder, more closed off, like a man carrying weight he couldn't set down. What do you think happened? June asked. Don't know. Could be anything. Could be nothing. But he'd picked up one of the documents from the pile. A land deed showing Silas had purchased not just the 5 acres where the cabin sat, but 3 additional parcels nearby. Total acreage, 213 acres of prairie land, all bought in late 1978 and early 1979. He spent most of that $15,000 on land, Grady said. Practically every penny of it went into buying up property in the same area. June had pulled out another document, a survey map with hand-drawn markings in pencil. Property lines marked clearly, with notes in the margins. Coordinates. Measurements. The detail of someone who wanted to know exactly what he owned and where the boundaries lay. "This is way more than just buying a place to live," she said. "This is like he was protecting something, or hiding from something." The thought had occurred to Grady too, but hearing June say it made it more real. "We don't know that. Could be he just liked his privacy." For 45 years, in a shack with no running water? June had given him a look that said she wasn't buying it. People who want privacy move to the suburbs. People who are hiding move to the middle of nowhere and bury metal boxes under their floors. Grady had smiled despite himself. "When did you get so smart?" "I pay attention. You taught me that." He'd gathered the documents, studying each one carefully. More land deeds, all properly filed and recorded. A will simple and direct, leaving everything to his sole surviving blood relative. A few old bills of sale for building materials, and then, almost missed at the bottom of the stack, a newspaper clipping from September 1978. The headline read, "3 workers killed in chemical accident at Hartwell site." Grady had read it aloud, his voice steady even as understanding started to dawn. An industrial accident at a Hartwell energy construction site claimed the lives of 3 workers Tuesday evening when a storage tank ruptured during routine maintenance. Company officials say the cause is under investigation, but preliminary reports suggest equipment failure. The deceased have been identified as Thomas Wade, 28, Carl Jennings, 34, and Robert Sullivan, 22. The article continued with quotes from company spokesmen offering condolences and promising full cooperation with authorities. The investigation would be thorough. Safety was their top priority, all the things companies said when workers died on their watch. June had been reading over his shoulder. Uncle Silas worked for Hartwell Energy. Looks that way. 3 people died in September. He got paid in August and bought land right after. Grady had set the clipping down carefully, not wanting to draw the conclusion that was forming in his mind, but unable to avoid it. Might not be connected. "It's all from the same year, Dad. The same company. And he kept this article for 45 years, hidden with everything else." She'd picked up the cashier's check again. What if this money was payment? What if they paid him to keep quiet about something? That's a serious accusation. Then why hide everything? Why live alone for the rest of his life? Why did someone watch us leave that cabin last night? June's voice had risen slightly, not with anger, but with the frustration of seeing something obvious that adults kept trying to explain away. Something happened at that company. Something bad. And Uncle Silas knew about it. Grady had moved to the window again, checking the parking lot out of habit. Morning traffic had picked up on the highway. Normal people going to normal jobs, their lives uncomplicated by mysterious inheritances and 40-year-old secrets. "Even if you're right," he'd said carefully. "It was a long time ago. Companies get sued, they settle, they move on. Whatever happened, it's ancient history." Then why were those people watching the cabin? She had him there. If this was ancient history, if the money was a settled debt and the secret was long buried, there'd be no reason for anyone to care about an old cabin or what might be hidden inside it, unless the secret wasn't as buried as everyone thought. Grady had turned from the window, looking at his daughter, really looking at her. For the first time in 3 years, she seemed fully present, engaged, fighting for something instead of just enduring it. Whatever else this mystery represented, it had sparked something in June he'd thought might be lost forever. "Okay," he'd said. "Let's find out what really happened." June's expression had shifted, something almost like hope crossing her features. "How?" "Same way we solve any problem. We get information." Grady had started repacking the box, but this time he'd photographed everything first with his phone. Documentation, just in case. "We're going back to the cabin, going to search it properly, and then we're going to find out who Silas Nix really was, and what he knew that was worth paying $15,000 to keep quiet." He'd locked the box in the truck's toolbox, secure and out of sight. They'd checked out of the motel, grabbed breakfast at a diner down the road, and headed back toward the property. This time, Grady was prepared. Tools in the truck. Phone fully charged, eyes open for anyone watching. Whatever they found at that cabin, whatever truth Silas had hidden away, they were going to bring it into the light. June had ridden beside him, the first real conversation they'd had in years still settling between them. Grady had reached over and squeezed her hand once, quick and gentle. "We'll figure it out, Junebug." She'd squeezed back. "I know, Dad." The cabin looked different in morning light. Less menacing, more just sad. A structure slowly surrendering to gravity and weather, its decay a kind of honesty. No vehicle sat on the rise this time, no watchers Grady could spot, just grassland and wind and the skeletal remains of his uncle's deliberate isolation. They'd parked closer this time, and Grady had taken his time studying the property before entering. The cabin itself sat near the center of what June had calculated was about 5 acres. Beyond it, according to the deeds, stretched another 200 acres that Silas had accumulated piece by piece in those early years. "What's that?" June had pointed to a structure about 100 yards from the cabin, partially hidden by tall grass. "Looks like an old well house. Or was, anyway." They'd approached it together, boots swishing through the dry vegetation. The structure was just 4 posts and a partial roof, the well itself capped with a rusted metal cover bolted into concrete. Someone had taken care to seal it properly, but time had done its work. The bolts had oxidized, the metal warped. "Think there's water down there?" June asked. "Maybe. Or maybe it's dry. Hard to tell without opening it up." Grady had made a mental note to check it later. For now, the cabin demanded their attention. Inside, with morning sun angling through the broken windows, details emerged that darkness had hidden. The pot-bellied stove wasn't just for heat. It was positioned for cooking, too, with a flat top and a vent pipe that disappeared through the roof. The shelves built into the wall weren't crude but carefully constructed, each board level and secure. The table where they'd set the box had been made by hand, dovetailed joints still tight after decades. Silas had been a craftsman, someone who knew how to build things that lasted. Grady had started a systematic search, beginning with the floorboards. He'd pulled up every one that would come loose, checking underneath for more hidden compartments. Most revealed only hard-packed dirt and the occasional startled spider. But beneath what had been the sleeping area, he'd found another hidden space. This one held a leather-bound journal, the pages warped with moisture. Damaged, but still readable. Behind the journal, wrapped in the same careful oilcloth, another stack of documents. "Dad," June had called from near the stove. "There's something here, too." She'd found a loose brick in the small chimney's base. Behind it, a zippered plastic bag containing more papers, these ones in better condition. Grady had brought them to the table, and they'd begun to go through everything together. The journal came first. Silas's handwriting was small and precise. Engineer's lettering. Many pages had been damaged, the ink run together or faded to nothing, but enough remained to paint a picture. July 12, 1977. Started at Site 7 today. Good crew, good pay. If this contract runs its course, I can finally get ahead. September 3, 1977. Concerns about the tank seals. Mentioned it to Patterson. He said corporate approved the equipment and we don't question it. Don't like that answer. November 19th, 1977. Met Sarah at the diner in Elk City. She's something special. Maybe there's more to life than work after all. The entries continued through early 1978, documenting normal life. Work, occasional mentions of Sarah, concerns about equipment that kept getting dismissed. Then a gap. No entries from late February through mid-March. The next entry was dated March 23, 1978. They're covering it up. I know what I saw. Patterson made it clear. Keep quiet or lose everything. But 3 men died because management ignored safety protocols. How do I live with this? June had looked up from the journal, her eyes wide. He saw something. Looks that way. Grady had flipped ahead, but the next several pages were too water-damaged to read. When the text became legible again, the tone had changed completely. August 10th, 1978. They made their offer. $15,000 to sign papers saying the investigation was thorough and complete. $15,000 to forget what I saw that night. $15,000 for my silence and my soul. August 15th, 1978. I took the money. God help me, I took it. Sarah says I had no choice, that they would have destroyed me either way. But I know what I am now. I know what I've become. August 30th, 1978. Bought land today. Far from everything, far from everyone. If I have to live with what I've done, I'll do it where I can see anyone coming from a mile away. The entries became sporadic after that, months or years between them. Brief notes about building the cabin. Mentions of Sarah growing less frequent, then stopping entirely. No explanation, just absence. Later entries had a different quality, more resigned, more alone. April 15th, 1985. It's been 7 years. Still think about those men every day. Still see their families at the inquest, trusting the investigation to find truth. We gave them lies instead. December 3rd, 1992. Saw a truck on the road today. Same make and model as the one Patterson drove. Heart nearly stopped before I realized it couldn't be him. But the fear remains. It always remains. The final entry was dated just 2 months before Silas's death. May 8th, 2024. If you're reading this, I'm gone. Good. I've carried this long enough. Everything you need is here. The truth I was too weak to tell. Don't be like me. Don't let fear keep you quiet. Those men deserve better than my silence bought them. Grady had set the journal down carefully, his hands not quite steady. He spent 45 years living with guilt. June had pulled out the documents from the plastic bag. These were photocopies, old but still clear. Internal company memos from Hartwell Energy. Pre-accident inspection reports showing known issues with tank seals and pressure valves. Work orders that had been submitted and denied due to cost concerns. And a list of names, employees who had been paid to sign statements certifying the investigation's completeness. Silas Nix was on that list. So were 14 others. But one name stood out, marked in Silas's careful hand with an asterisk. Dale Hartwell, Jr., site supervisor, now listed in a margin note as Oklahoma State Senator, District 12. June had looked up from the papers. One of the people who covered it up is a senator now. Apparently. Grady had pulled out his phone, searching for the name. Dale Hartwell, Jr.'s official photo appeared, early 60s, silver hair, expensive suit, confident smile. His biography listed his background in energy management before entering public service. No mention of his role in a 1978 industrial accident. This is why someone was watching the cabin, June said quietly. This is what they're worried about. Grady had gathered all the documents together, photographing each page methodically. The journal, the inspection reports, the list of names. Evidence that 3 men had died due to negligence and that the company had paid people to help bury the truth. We need to verify this, he said. Land deeds are one thing. Accusations about a cover-up are something else entirely. They'd left the cabin and driven to the Custer County Courthouse, where public records were kept. An elderly clerk with bifocals and a patient manner had helped them access archived property records, confirming everything Silas's deeds claimed. The land was real. The purchases were documented. Silas Nix had owned exactly what he said he owned, but it was a comment from the clerk, offered casually as Grady gathered the documents, that made his blood run cold. "You're the second person asking about the Nix property this month," she'd said, peering at Grady over her glasses. "Other fellow was here about 3 weeks ago. Wanted to know the same things. Who owned it, whether it was for sale, what the property included. You remember what he looked like? Tall, suit and tie, which you don't see much around here. Polite enough, but something cold about him." She'd shrugged. "Could have been a developer, I suppose. We get them sometimes looking for land to build on." "Did he give a name?" "If he did, I don't recall it, but he spent a good hour going through the same records you've been looking at." Grady and June had returned to the truck in silence, both processing what they'd learned. Someone had been researching Silas's property weeks before Silas died, waiting for something, preparing for something. "They knew he couldn't live forever," June said as they pulled away from the courthouse. "They were getting ready for when the property changed hands." "That's a lot of assuming." "Is it? Uncle Silas kept evidence of a cover-up. Someone powerful has reasons to want that evidence destroyed. Uncle Silas dies, and suddenly people are very interested in his property." She turned to look at Grady directly. "We found what they're looking for, Dad. What do we do now?" It was a fair question, and Grady didn't have a good answer. They could walk away, deposit the money, drive to Ellen's, pretend they never saw the rest of it. The easy path, the safe path. Or they could finish what Silas had started. Bring the truth into daylight, regardless of who it hurt or what it cost. The right path, maybe, but definitely not the safe one. Grady had thought about the journal entries. Silas's decades of guilt, his final plea not to let those deaths mean nothing. He'd thought about June beside him, finally engaged with life again, finally caring about something larger than her own quiet pain. "We find out who those 3 men were," he'd said finally. "We find out what really happened, and then we decide what truth is worth." June had nodded, satisfied. "Where do we start?" "Library. They'll have newspaper archives going back to the 70s. We need to know the whole story before we do anything else." The Elk City Public Library was a low brick building with wide windows and the particular hush that libraries carry. A young librarian had directed them to the microfiche machine in the back, showing June how to load the film and scroll through old newspapers. They'd found the accident report easily enough. Front page of the Elk City Daily News, September 19th, 1978. But it was the obituaries that made it real. 3 men, each with their own notice, each with families and futures cut short. Thomas Wade, 28, survived by his wife Patricia and infant daughter Emma. Former Marine, skilled welder, remembered for his laugh and his loyalty. Carl Jennings, 34, survived by his wife Margaret and children, 2 boys and a girl. Little league coach, church deacon, known for helping neighbors whenever asked. Robert Sullivan, 22, engaged to be married that December. Studied engineering at night while working days. Dreamed of designing safer equipment. June had read each obituary carefully, then printed them on the library's ancient printer. These are real people. They had real lives. They did. Grady had stared at the grainy photos accompanying each notice, young men smiling, unaware of what waited. And someone decided those lives were worth less than protecting a company's reputation. They'd spent another 2 hours in the library, searching for follow-up articles. The investigation had been brief, the conclusions predetermined. Equipment failure, tragic accident, no criminal negligence found. The case closed within 6 weeks, and Hartwell Energy had paid settlements to the families. Amounts undisclosed. Grady had photographed everything, building a file of evidence on his phone. The truth Silas couldn't tell. The story someone had paid to keep quiet. As they'd walked back to the truck in the late afternoon heat, June had asked the question Grady had been avoiding. What happens when they find out we have all this? Don't know, but I suspect we'll find out soon enough. He'd been right about that. When they'd returned to the cabin one more time to check the well area, making sure they hadn't missed anything, a dark SUV was waiting in the distance. This time, it wasn't hiding. That evening, back at a different motel, this one 20 miles south, chosen deliberately for its distance from the property, Grady and June had spread out everything they'd gathered. Photographs, journal entries, public records, obituaries. The pieces of a 45-year-old cover-up laid bare on cheap motel furniture. June had been working on her laptop, the one Grady had bought her for school last year, cross-referencing names and dates. She'd always been good with details, and now that careful attention had purpose beyond homework. The timeline makes sense, she'd said, her fingers moving across the keyboard. February 1978. Uncle Silas reports safety concerns about tank seals. March, there's that gap in his journal entries. September, the accident happens. August, right before the accident, he gets paid off and buys land. Why pay him in August if the accident didn't happen until September? Grady had been puzzling over that detail. June had stopped typing, thinking it through. Maybe the payment wasn't about the accident. Maybe it was about what he saw before the accident. What do you mean? Look at the journal. He mentioned seeing something. They're covering it up. I know what I saw. What if there was an earlier incident? Something that showed the equipment was dangerous, and the company covered that up. Then, when the big accident happened, they already had him locked into silence. It made a kind of sick sense. Pay off the witness to the near miss so he couldn't testify when the disaster came. Grady had seen enough corporate maneuvering in his trucking days to know how these things worked. Liability was everything. Plausible deniability was worth whatever it cost. He'd pulled out the company memos they'd found, reading them more carefully now. One in particular caught his attention, dated March 15, 1978, from the site supervisor to corporate management. Incident report. On March 12th, Tank 7 experienced pressure fluctuation, resulting in minor seal breach. No injuries. Situation contained by quick action of site foreman Silas Nix. Recommend immediate equipment inspection and replacement of all seals on similar tanks. Cost estimate, $42,000. Awaiting approval to proceed. The response, dated March 20th. Seal replacement cost excessive and unnecessary. Continue operations with increased monitoring. Site supervisor will ensure compliance with all safety protocols. Signed by Dale Hartwell, Jr., Site Supervisor. June had read over his shoulder. There it is. They knew the seals were failing. Uncle Silas reported it. They said no because it was too expensive. 6 months later, 3 people died. And Silas knew he'd documented it. Knew he'd gone through proper channels, which meant when the fatal accident happened, he had proof they'd ignored warnings. Grady had set the memo down carefully. That's what made him dangerous. That's what they paid him to forget. They'd worked in silence for a while. June typing notes, Grady studying photographs. The grainy faces of men long dead, the industrial sites where tragedy had unfolded, the paper trail of negligence and cover-up. Finally, June had pushed back from the laptop. I found something else. Dale Hartwell, Jr. isn't just a senator. He's running for Congress. Primaries in 3 months. Grady had moved to look at the screen. Campaign website, professional photos, promises of jobs and prosperity and family values. No mention of his background in energy management. Nothing about his time at Hartwell Energy Corporation, the company his father had founded. This would destroy him, June said quietly. If this came out now, right before the primary, his campaign would be over. That's not why we'd release it. I know, but it's why they're so worried about it. She'd pulled up another tab, News articles about the senator's campaign, his lead in the polls, his endorsements from business groups. He's got a lot to lose. Grady's phone had buzzed then, an unknown number. He'd let it go to voicemail, but whoever it was called back immediately. The third time he'd answered, "Mr. Nix." A man's voice, smooth and professional. "My name is Richard Patterson. I'm an attorney representing certain interests related to the property you recently inherited." "What kind of interests?" "The kind that would very much like to meet with you to discuss the matter privately. I understand you've been asking questions about events from 1978. Those events are complex, and the public record doesn't tell the full story." "I'm listening to the full story right now, thanks. My uncle left very thorough notes." A pause then. "Mr. Nix, I'm going to be direct with you. Whatever your uncle left behind, it represents a very old dispute that was settled decades ago. The families of those workers received compensation. The company paid fines. Justice was served within the legal framework of the time. 3 men died because someone decided safety equipment was too expensive. That's not justice. That's murder by spreadsheet. That's an inflammatory characterization of a tragic industrial accident." Patterson's voice had cooled several degrees. "But let's say you're right. Let's say there was negligence. The statute of limitations has long since passed. No charges can be filed. No legal action can be taken. All you would accomplish by making this public is hurting people who had no control over decisions made before most of them were born. People like Senator Hartwell." Another pause, longer this time. Senator Hartwell was a young site supervisor following orders from corporate management. He spent his career since then in public service, helping people, creating jobs, improving lives. Destroying his reputation over something that happened when he was 24 years old would be vindictive and pointless. Grady had looked at June, who was listening intently to his side of the conversation. "And what exactly are you proposing, Mr. Patterson?" "A meeting, tomorrow if possible. We can discuss this situation like reasonable people and find a resolution that benefits everyone involved. You're a practical man, Mr. Nix. A father. You understand that sometimes the past is better left undisturbed." "Where and when?" "There's a diner off Highway 40, the Silver Spur. Noon tomorrow, just you and me, no one else. We talk, we work something out. Simple as that." "I'll think about it." "I hope you will. Because the alternative to talking, well, that gets complicated in ways that don't help anybody, especially not a man trying to provide for his daughter." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Grady had felt anger flare in his chest, hot and immediate, but he'd kept his voice level. "Is that a threat, Mr. Patterson?" "It's a reality check. You're holding documents that could embarrass some powerful people. Those people have resources and motivation to protect their interests. I'm offering you a chance to walk away from this with compensation and dignity intact. I'd suggest taking it seriously. I'll be at the diner at noon. But if anything happens to me or my daughter, everything I've found goes to the press, the state police, and the FBI. That clear enough for you?" "Crystal clear, Mr. Nix. I look forward to our conversation." The call had ended, and Grady had set the phone down, his hands shaking slightly with suppressed adrenaline. June had been watching him, her face pale but determined. "He threatened us." "He tried to. What are you going to do?" Grady had thought about it, weighing options. The smart play was probably to take whatever deal they offered. Money, silence, everyone walks away. They'd already found the cash in the box. Adding more to it wouldn't hurt. They could start over somewhere, put this whole mess behind them. But he kept thinking about Silas's journal entries. 45 years of guilt. 45 years of wishing he'd been braver. The final plea not to let those deaths mean nothing. And he thought about the men who died. Thomas Wade, who'd never seen his daughter grow up. Carl Jennings, whose kids had lost their father. Robert Sullivan, who'd never made it to his wedding. "I'm going to that meeting," he'd said. "But first, We're going to make copies of everything and send them somewhere safe. Multiple somewheres. And you're going to stay with Aunt Ellen while I do this. No way, I'm not leaving you. June. No, Dad. We started this together. We finish it together. Her jaw was set in that way that reminded Grady of her mother. Stubborn, immovable. Besides, you need me. I'm better with computers than you are. If we're sending copies, I know how to encrypt them, upload them to the cloud, make sure they can't just disappear if something happens to us. She was right, though Grady didn't want to admit it. This could get dangerous. It already is dangerous. That's why you need backup. June had stood up, moving to gather the documents. Come on. There's a FedEx office that's open until 9. We can scan everything, send physical copies to Aunt Ellen, and upload encrypted files to 3 different cloud services. By midnight, this information will be impossible to suppress. Grady had looked at his daughter, this quiet, careful girl who'd spent 3 years barely speaking, now organizing a plan to expose a decades-old cover-up with the efficiency of a seasoned investigator. Whatever else this inheritance had brought them, it had given him back something he'd thought was lost. His daughter's fire, her sense of purpose, her willingness to fight for what mattered. Okay, he'd said, we do this together. But if things go sideways, you promise me you'll run. Get to Ellen's, get safe, let the authorities handle it. Promise, she'd said, though they both knew she didn't mean it. They'd spent the next 3 hours at the FedEx office, scanning documents, encrypting files, preparing packages to mail. By the time they returned to the motel, exhausted, multiple copies of Silas's evidence existed in locations spread across the country in the internet. Whatever happened at tomorrow's meeting, the truth was already out of their hands. The question now was what price they'd have to pay for releasing it. Grady had lain awake that night, listening to June's steady breathing from the other bed, thinking about his uncle, a man who'd made one compromise, taken one payment, and spent the rest of his life in self-imposed exile because of it. He wouldn't make that same choice. Whatever Patterson offered tomorrow, whatever threats came with it, Grady was going to finish what Silas had started. For 3 men who died too young. For a daughter who was watching to see what kind of man her father really was. For himself and the legacy he wanted to leave. Some inheritances, he'd realized, weren't about money or land. They were about courage, about doing what was right, even when it cost you everything. Outside, the prairie night stretched endlessly in all directions. Somewhere out there, powerful, people were making plans, calculating risks, deciding how to handle the problem of Grady Nix. Let them plan. He'd be ready. Grady had arrived at the Silver Spur Diner 15 minutes early, parking where he could watch the entrance. June had wanted to come, but he'd convinced her to stay at the motel with strict instructions to call the police if he wasn't back in 2 hours. She'd agreed reluctantly, but only after making him promise to record the conversation on his phone. The diner was the kind of place that existed in every small town. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in 1985. A handful of locals occupied scattered tables, talking quietly over eggs and bacon. Nobody paid Grady any attention as he took a booth near the back with a clear view of the door. Richard Patterson had arrived exactly at noon, and Grady recognized the type immediately. Expensive suit that probably cost more than Grady's truck. Silver hair styled just so. Confident stride that came from years of winning. He'd scanned the room, spotted Grady, and approached with his hand already extended. "Mr. Nix, thank you for meeting with me." Grady had shaken the offered hand briefly. "Let's get to it, Mr. Patterson. I've got places to be." Patterson had slid into the opposite side of the booth, ordered coffee when the waitress appeared, waited until she'd moved away before speaking. "I appreciate directness. So let me be direct. You've come into possession of documents related to an industrial accident from 1978. Those documents represent your late uncle's personal files and his personal perspective on events from nearly half a century ago. They represent evidence of criminal negligence that resulted in 3 deaths. That's one interpretation. The official investigation at the time reached different conclusions. Patterson had sipped his coffee, his expression neutral. But let's say you're right. Let's say there was negligence. As I mentioned yesterday, the statute of limitations has expired. No charges can be filed. The families received settlements. The matter was legally concluded decades ago. Then why are we having this conversation? Patterson had set down his cup carefully. Because my clients understand that you might want to publicize these documents anyway. And while that wouldn't result in legal consequences for anyone involved, it would cause unnecessary pain to families who have long since moved on, and it would damage reputations built over decades of hard work and public service. Your client being Senator Hartwell. Among others. Patterson had pulled a folder from his briefcase, sliding it across the table. This is what I'm authorized to offer you, $100,000, cash or check as you prefer. In exchange, you provide all documents related to the 1978 incident, including originals and any copies you've made. You sign a non-disclosure agreement, promising not to discuss the matter publicly. And you sell the inherited property to a buyer we represent for fair market value, plus an additional $50,000 as a premium. Grady had opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. A contract remarkably specific and detailed, obviously prepared in advance, ready for his signature. That's a lot of money to pay for nothing, he'd said. It's a lot of money to pay for discretion and closure. You're a man with financial challenges, Mr. Nix. This would solve those challenges immediately. You could start fresh, provide for your daughter, move forward with your life. And 3 men stay forgotten. Patterson's expression had hardened slightly. Those men haven't been forgotten. Their families remember them. But dragging their deaths back into public view 45 years later doesn't honor them. It just opens old wounds. Or it finally gives them justice. Justice? Patterson had leaned forward. You want to talk about justice? Thomas Wade's daughter is 53 years old now. She's built a life. She doesn't need reporters calling to ask about her father's death. Carl Jennings' widow remarried, had more children, found peace. You think she wants to relive the worst day of her life because you decided to play amateur investigator? Robert Sullivan's fiancée moved on, married someone else, raised a family. How does disrupting all of that serve justice? Grady had felt the argument land. Patterson was good at his job. He knew where to push. What about the truth? The truth is whatever helps people move forward with their lives. Sometimes that truth is complex. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. But after 45 years, what matters more? Being right about the past, or doing right by the present? You're asking me to bury this. I'm asking you to consider whether exposing it helps anyone. Senator Hartwell has served this state for 20 years. He's brought jobs, improved schools, fought for veterans. Yes, he made mistakes as a young man following corporate orders. But he spent his adult life trying to make amends through public service. Destroying that doesn't bring anyone back from the dead. Grady had sat back studying Patterson. Everything the man said was designed to make accepting the money feel like the moral choice. Take the cash, walk away, let everyone get on with their lives. It was seductive reasoning, and Grady could feel himself wanting to believe it. Then he'd thought about Silas's journal, the man his uncle had become, the weight of compromise carried for decades, the final plea not to repeat his mistake. You know what my uncle wrote in his journal, Grady had said quietly. He wrote that he'd sold his soul for $15,000, spent 45 years alone on empty prairie because he couldn't live with what he'd done, couldn't face Sarah, whoever she was, couldn't face himself in the mirror. You're asking me to make the same deal he made, just with more zeros on the check. I'm offering you a chance to be practical. Silas thought he was being practical too. right up until he realized he'd traded away the only thing that really mattered. Grady had pushed the folder back across the table. "I'm not signing that." Patterson's eyes had gone cold. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe, but it'll be my mistake, not someone else's." "Mr. Nix, I need you to understand something." Patterson had leaned in, his voice dropping. "The people I represent have considerable resources. Legal resources, primarily, but also political connections, media relationships, investigative capabilities. If you insist on pursuing this, they will examine every aspect of your life. Every tax return, every traffic ticket, every dispute with a neighbor or employer. They will find things, Mr. Nix. Everyone has things, and they will use what they find to discredit you before you ever get a chance to speak. That's definitely a threat. It's a warning. You're not a crusader. You're not a journalist or a lawyer. You're an unemployed truck driver with a daughter to protect. This fight isn't for you." Grady had stood up, dropping a 20 on the table for coffee he hadn't touched. "Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Patterson. I'm going to contact the families of those 3 men. I'm going to tell them what I found and let them decide what to do with it. After that, I'm going to contact the press and the authorities, and then I'm going to let the chips fall where they may. You'll regret this. Probably, but I won't regret it for 45 years like my uncle did." Grady had started to walk away, then turned back. "Tell Senator Hartwell he had his chance to make this right decades ago. He chose money over truth then. That's on him. What happens now? That's on him too." He'd left the diner, his heart pounding but his resolve solid. The recording on his phone had captured everything: the offer, the threats, Patterson's admission that powerful people were willing to pay substantially to keep this quiet. More evidence for the file. June had been waiting at the motel, her laptop open, her face tense with worry. When Grady walked through the door, she'd nearly knocked him over with a hug. "You're okay." "I'm okay. They offered money. A lot of money. I said no." She'd pulled back, studying his face. "Why?" "Because your great-uncle spent his whole life regretting saying yes. And because you need to know that some things matter more than money." June had nodded slowly, then returned to her laptop. "Good. Because while you were gone, I did something." "What?" "I found contact information for the victims' families. Or at least, I found some of them." She'd turned the screen toward him. "Thomas Wade's daughter Emma lives in Tulsa. Carl Jennings' son Matthew is in Oklahoma City. I couldn't find anyone for Robert Sullivan, but I'm still looking." Grady had sat down beside her, looking at the names and addresses she'd compiled. Real people, real families, people who deserved to know the truth about how their loved ones had died. "We need to be careful about this," he'd said. "We need to approach them the right way, give them time to process it." "I know, I wrote draft letters. Want to see?" She'd pulled up a document, and Grady had read it over her shoulder. It was good, respectful, clear, offering information without demanding anything, giving them the choice of what to do next. "You're sure about this, Junebug? Once we send these, there's no taking it back. Things are going to get complicated." "I'm sure. Are you?" Grady had thought about Patterson's threats, about the resources arrayed against them, about all the ways this could go wrong. Then he'd thought about 3 men who'd gone to work one day and never came home. About families who'd been told it was just a tragic accident, nothing anyone could have prevented. About Silas, eating alone in that cabin, carrying guilt until it finally buried him. "Yeah," he'd said, "I'm sure." They'd spent the rest of the afternoon refining the letters, printing them on motel stationery, preparing them for mailing. Personal touches, copies of the obituaries, photocopies of key documents, Grady's phone number if anyone wanted to talk. At sunset, they'd driven to the post office and dropped them in the mail. 3 letters, 3 families, 1 truth that had been buried for 45 years. No going back now. That night, Grady had made one more trip to the cabin, alone this time at June's insistence that she stay somewhere safe. He'd parked a half-mile out and walked in, carrying a flashlight and a shovel. The well house waited in darkness, the rusted cap still bolted tight. According to Silas's notes, the ones they'd found in the final hidden compartment, this was where the original documents were buried. The actual inspection reports, the pre-accident photographs, the physical evidence that proved the company knew about the danger and chose to ignore it. Insurance, Silas had called it. Protection against the day they tried to silence him permanently. Grady had worked carefully, removing the bolts one by one, lifting the heavy cap aside. His flashlight beam disappeared into darkness below. No water. The well had been dry for years. Just empty space and, according to Silas's measurements, a waterproof container buried at exactly 23 feet down. Grady had rigged a rope and begun the descent, his boots finding purchase on the rough stone walls. It was slow work, dangerous work, but he'd done harder things in his trucking days. At the bottom, his flashlight had found what Silas promised, a sealed metal container, professional grade, the kind used for long-term storage. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of protection, original documents, pre-accident photographs showing equipment damage, inspection reports signed and submitted, rejection letters from corporate, the paper trail of negligence preserved in meticulous detail. This was what they'd been looking for. This was why someone had been watching the property. This was proof that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as memory or interpretation. Grady had photographed everything, then sealed it back up and made the climb out. By the time he'd replaced the well cap and walked back to his truck, the eastern sky was starting to lighten with pre-dawn gray. He'd driven back to the motel, exhausted but somehow lighter than he'd felt in years. The truth was out now, documented, distributed, impossible to suppress. Whatever came next, at least it would come honestly. Grady had been back at the motel for less than an hour when June found it. She'd been going through the photographs he'd taken of the well documents, cross-referencing them with the materials they'd found earlier, when she'd stopped suddenly, her face going pale. "Dad, you need to see this." Grady had moved to look over her shoulder at the laptop screen. She'd pulled up one of the original inspection reports from the well dated February 28, 1978. The report detailed tank seal deterioration and recommended immediate replacement. It was signed by the site foreman, Silas Nix. "I already saw that one," Grady had said. "Look at the bottom, the additional signatures." Grady had looked closer. Below Silas's signature, 3 more names: Dale Hartwell, Jr., Site Supervisor; Richard Patterson, Safety Compliance Officer; and a third name that made Grady's stomach drop: James Patterson, Corporate Legal Counsel. "Patterson," he'd said slowly. "The lawyer we met yesterday. His father worked for Hartwell Energy, was their legal counsel during the cover-up." June had pulled up another document, the list of people who'd been paid to sign settlement agreements. James Patterson's name appeared there too, receiving $20,000. "The lawyer who threatened us yesterday comes from a family that helped bury this thing from the start." Grady had felt anger building in his chest. That son of a bitch sat across from me and talked about moving on, about not opening old wounds, and his own father took money to help make sure nobody ever knew what really happened. But June was shaking her head, still scrolling through documents. "There's more. Look at this." She'd pulled up a photograph from the well container, one Grady had glanced at but not studied closely. It showed the accident scene, taken the night of the explosion. 3 bodies covered with tarps, emergency vehicles, workers standing around in shock, and in the background, barely visible in the harsh work lights, several men in suits talking to someone in uniform. June had zoomed in on the image, enhancing it as much as the resolution allowed. One of the suited men was clearly a younger James Patterson. The others, Grady couldn't be certain from the grainy photo, but they had the look of corporate management. They were there that night, June said. The lawyers, the executives, they were on site within hours of the accident. Controlling the narrative from the beginning, look at the timestamp on the photo. She'd pointed to the corner of the image. This was taken at 11:47 p.m. The accident happened at 9:30 according to the news reports. They got lawyers on site in 2 hours. But emergency services? The newspaper said they didn't arrive until after midnight because of the remote location. Grady had absorbed the implication. They had lawyers there before they had ambulances. They knew what they were covering up before the bodies were even cold. June had minimized the photo and pulled up another document, one Grady hadn't seen before. And there's this. It was a letter, handwritten on the personal stationery. The date was May 8, 2024, just 2 months before Silas's death. It was addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Grady had read it aloud, his voice unsteady. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. I hope I've been gone for a while, honestly. Long enough that the guilt has finally stopped following me around. But I doubt it. I think guilt like mine probably survives death. Probably sits waiting in whatever comes next. My name is Silas Nix, and I need you to understand something. I wasn't just a witness to what happened in 1978. I was part of it, not the accident itself. I wasn't there that night, thank God. But what came after, and worse, what came before. In February of that year, I inspected Tank 7, found the seals deteriorating badly. I wrote a report saying they needed immediate replacement. I submitted it through proper channels. Dale Hartwell Jr. reviewed it, sent it up to corporate, and they sent back orders to continue operations. Too expensive to fix, they said. Would delay the project, cost too much money. I should have refused, should have shut the site down myself, should have called the state inspectors. But I was 32 years old, making good money for the first time in my life. I had Sarah, I had plans. I told myself it wasn't my call to make. I'd documented the problem, I'd done my part. What happened after that was on management. March 12th, there was an incident. Tank 7 had a pressure surge. The seals I'd warned about partially failed. We got lucky. The rupture was small, the chemical release minimal, and the wind was blowing away from the crew. Nobody got hurt, but it was close, terrifyingly close. I wrote another report, demanded shutdown and repairs. Corporate sent James Patterson, their legal counsel, to the site. He sat me down in a trailer and explained reality to me. Shutting down would cost the company millions, would probably kill the whole project, would cost every man on that site his job, including me. And all over what? A minor incident with no injuries, equipment that was technically still within operational parameters. They wanted me to revise my report, downgrade it from a demand to a suggestion, call it a maintenance recommendation rather than a critical safety issue. In exchange, they'd give me a promotion, more money, better assignments after this project wrapped up. I revised the report. God help me. I rewrote history and signed my name to it. Told myself I was protecting the crew's jobs. Told myself I was being reasonable, being a team player. Told myself all the lies cowards tell themselves when they're doing wrong for profit. 6 months later, Tank 7 ruptured completely. 3 men died. Good men. Men with families. Men who trusted their employer to keep them safe. Men who trusted me to do my job and protect them. The investigation started immediately, and I knew I was the key witness. I had the original reports, the documentation of what I'd found and what I'd recommended. I could prove the company knew about the danger and ignored it. I could prove they'd pressured me to soften my warnings. That's when they came back. Patterson, Hartwell, corporate executives whose names I never learned. They offered $15,000, more money than I'd made in the previous 3 years combined. All I had to do was sign a statement saying the investigation had been thorough, the conclusions accurate, the accident unavoidable. And I had to destroy my original documentation. I didn't destroy it. I kept it, told myself that was some kind of moral victory. But I took the money. I signed the statement. I looked 3 widows and 3 sets of children in the eye during that inquest and told them their loved ones died in an unavoidable accident when I knew it could have been prevented. I used that money to buy this land, built this cabin in the middle of nowhere because I couldn't stand to be around people anymore. Couldn't stand seeing my reflection in Sarah's eyes, knowing what kind of man I'd become. She left eventually. Can't blame her for that. Who wants to love a coward? I kept the evidence hidden, called it insurance, told myself I might need leverage someday. But the truth is, I was too afraid to use it, too afraid of what they'd do if I came forward, too afraid of admitting publicly what I'd done. So I lived here, alone, letting the years pile up like dust in corners, each one heavier than the last. I thought maybe time would make it easier. It didn't. It just gave me more days to remember what I'd chosen and who I'd betrayed. But here's the thing about guilt. Eventually, you get tired of carrying it. Eventually, you realize that you're going to die with this weight on your chest, and maybe you can at least pass the truth to someone willing to be braver than you were. Everything you need is in that well. The real inspection reports, the original photographs, the paper trail they paid me to destroy. It's all there, protected, waiting for someone with more courage than I had. The land itself matters too. That's why I bought so much of it, why I never sold even when I needed money. Tank 7 is buried out there, about 200 yards northwest of the cabin. They filled it in after the accident, covered it over, tried to make it disappear. But it's still there, and the soil around it is still contaminated. I've had it tested, anonymously, paying in cash. The chemical levels are high enough that nobody should ever build on that land or use that groundwater. They'll come for this property eventually. When I'm gone, they'll try to buy it from whoever inherits it. They'll want to develop it or resell it, and they'll want those documents destroyed first. Don't let them have it. Don't make my mistake. I was a coward when it mattered. I chose comfort over truth, money over justice, fear over courage. I let 3 good men's deaths go unavenged because I was too weak to face what standing up would cost me. Don't be like me. Don't spend 45 years wishing you'd been braver. Don't die alone in a cabin you built from blood money, surrounded by nothing but regret. Those men's names were Thomas Wade, Carl Jennings, and Robert Sullivan. Say them out loud. Remember them. Give them the justice I was too afraid to demand. I'm sorry I failed them. I'm sorry I failed everyone, including myself, but maybe you can finish what I should have started. Silas Nix. Grady had finished reading and set the letter down, his hands shaking. The room felt too small suddenly, the air too thick. Beside him, June was crying silently, tears running down her face. He wasn't just a witness, she said quietly. He helped them cover it up. He changed his report. He took money. He lied under oath. And spent the rest of his life paying for it. Grady had picked up the letter again, reading certain passages. He kept the evidence, but he was too afraid to use it, just kept it as insurance, hoping he'd never have to make the choice. The land, June said, wiping her eyes. That's why he bought so much. That's why he never sold. The contamination is still there. Grady had felt the full weight of it settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about exposing a cover-up anymore. This was about toxic waste buried under prairie soil, about contaminated groundwater that could affect anyone who built on that land or drilled a well, about an environmental crime compounding the human one. They don't just want the documents destroyed, he said slowly. They want that land so they can develop it or flip it before anyone tests the soil. And whoever buys it from them will never know they're building on poisoned ground. That's why Patterson offered so much money, $50,000 premium on top of market value. They need someone to sell without asking questions. Grady had moved to the window, looking out at the Oklahoma morning. Somewhere out there, powerful people were waiting for him to make a choice. Take the money, sign the papers, let the past stay buried, literally and figuratively. But now he knew the full truth, knew that walking away meant not just covering up 3 deaths, but potentially exposing unknown numbers of future families to toxic contamination. Knew that his uncle had died carrying the weight of his compromise, hoping someone else would have the courage he'd lacked. "We can't sell that land," he said. "No," June agreed. "We can't. And we can't just release the documents without explaining the contamination. People need to know the whole story." "What do we do?" Grady had turned from the window, looking at his daughter, this brave, brilliant girl who'd stood beside him through all of this. "We do what Silas asked. We finish what he should have started. We get environmental testing done on that land. We contact the EPA. We make sure everyone knows not just what happened in 1978, but what's still happening now, under the ground, invisible but dangerous. They'll come after us hard for that." "I know. It could take months. Years, maybe. Legal battles. Investigations. We don't have money for lawyers." "I know that too." Grady had sat down beside her, taking her hand. "But we have something more important than money. We have the truth, and we have each other. That's going to have to be enough." June had squeezed his hand, her grip strong despite her slim fingers. "Uncle Silas said the land is contaminated. Where exactly?" Grady had pulled up the survey maps on his phone, the ones Silas had marked so carefully. 200 yards northwest of the cabin. He said Tank 7 is buried there. "We should go look, document it, take soil samples if we can. That's trespassing on our own land." June had smiled slightly. "Technically, it's not trespassing if it's ours." "Technically," Grady had agreed. "Get your things. We're going back to the cabin one more time. But this time, we're bringing cameras and we're bringing evidence bags. Whatever's buried out there, we're going to prove it." They'd packed quickly, gathering equipment. Grady's old work gloves, plastic bags, a camera, the survey maps, and the coordinates Silas had documented. Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher, burning off the last of the dawn coolness. This was it. The moment when they stopped reacting and started acting. When they took control of the narrative and forced the truth into daylight, regardless of cost. Grady had looked at June across the truck cab. "Last chance to change your mind. We can still take the money, walk away, let someone else fight this battle." June had shaken her head. "Uncle Silas said, don't be like him. Don't spend your life wishing you'd been braver. I don't want to spend my life like that. Do you?" "No," Grady had said. "I don't." He'd started the truck and headed toward the property one final time, knowing that everything was about to change. Knowing that some inheritances came with a price, and knowing, finally, that some prices were worth paying. The property looked different now that Grady knew what it was hiding. Not just a broken cabin on empty prairie, but a carefully constructed defense against secrets that had been buried in more ways than one. Silas hadn't chosen this location randomly. He'd positioned himself as guardian over evidence both documentary and physical, spending 45 years making sure nobody developed this land without knowing what lay beneath it. Grady had parked the truck near the cabin, and they'd approached on foot, carrying their equipment in a backpack. The survey maps showed the burial site northwest of the structure, about 2 football fields away. Silas's notes had been precise. Tank 7 buried at coordinates N35.6847, W99.156. Depth approximately 8 feet, surrounded by contaminated soil extending minimum 50 feet in all directions. June had the coordinates pulled up on her phone, using the GPS to guide them. The prairie grass grew tall here, untouched by cattle or mowing, swaying in the constant wind. Nothing about the landscape suggested anything different beneath the surface. That was the insidious thing about buried contamination. It could poison silently, invisibly, for generations. "Here," June had said, stopping at a spot that looked identical to everywhere else around them. "This is where the coordinates point." Grady had knelt, running his hands through the grass. The soil beneath looked normal. Dry, sandy, the typical Oklahoma prairie earth. But according to Silas's testing notes, this soil contained chemical contamination from the tank rupture, levels high enough to make it unsuitable for development or agriculture. They'd worked methodically, using Grady's work gloves to collect soil samples from various depths, sealing each one in labeled plastic bags with the GPS coordinates and timestamp noted. June had photographed everything, creating a detailed record of the location and their collection process. "If we're going to prove contamination, we need to do this right," Grady had said. "Chain of custody, proper documentation, everything by the book so nobody can claim we fabricated evidence." "Where do we get the samples tested?" "State Environmental Lab, maybe. Or we could contact the EPA directly, ask them to do their own testing." Grady had stood, surveying the area. "But first we need to mark this location clearly. Make sure it's documented in a way that can't be ignored." They'd spent the next hour placing markers, wooden stakes they'd bought at a hardware store, each one numbered and corresponding to a soil sample. June had created a detailed map on her phone, uploading it to the cloud storage where they'd backed up everything else. By the time they finished, sweat was running down Grady's back despite the morning coolness. They'd collected 15 samples from a grid pattern covering the suspected contamination zone, all properly labeled, all documented with photographs and GPS data. "Now what?" June had asked. Before Grady could answer, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Nix, this is Emma Wade. Thomas Wade was my father. I received your letter today. I would very much like to speak with you. Please call me at your earliest convenience." Grady's breath had caught. The letters had reached their destinations. The victims' families were responding. This was real now, in ways it hadn't been when they were just researching old documents and taking soil samples. "One of the families wants to talk," he'd told June, showing her the message. "Are you going to call her?" "Yeah, but not here. Let's get back to the truck, secure these samples, and then I'll call from somewhere we can talk properly." They'd walked back across the property, Grady carrying the backpack of soil samples carefully, aware that this physical evidence might be crucial to proving the contamination claim. June had walked beside him, quiet but alert, her eyes scanning the horizon. That's why she saw them first. "Dad," she'd said quietly, "we've got company." 2 vehicles had pulled up near their truck. The dark SUV from before, and a second car, a sedan that screamed government or corporate. 4 people stood waiting, and even from a distance, Grady recognized Richard Patterson. "Stay close to me," Grady had said to June. "If things get ugly, you run for the cabin and call 911, understand? I'm not leaving you. June, not happening, Dad." Her jaw was set in that stubborn line he'd come to know well. "We finish this together." They'd approached the vehicles slowly, Grady deliberately keeping his body between June and the waiting men. Patterson stood front and center, flanked by 2 men in suits who had the hard-eyed look of security or law enforcement. The 4th person was a woman in business attire, holding a briefcase and watching them with cool assessment. "Mr. Nix," Patterson had said as they got within speaking distance, "I see you've been doing some amateur environmental testing. Just collecting samples from land I own. That's not illegal." "No, it's not, but trespassing onto the site of sealed government remediation is." Patterson had gestured to the woman. "This is Margaret Chen from the State Environmental Quality Department. She's here to inform you that the area you were just sampling has been properly remediated and sealed according to federal guidelines." The woman had stepped forward, opening her briefcase to retrieve documents. Mr. Nix, in 1979, following the industrial accident at this site, Hartwell Energy Corporation conducted extensive environmental remediation under supervision of state and federal authorities. All contaminated materials were properly removed or neutralized. The site was tested, certified clean, and officially closed. Any attempt to suggest ongoing contamination is not only false, but potentially libelous. Grady had felt his stomach drop. They'd gotten ahead of him. Somehow, in the few hours since his meeting with Patterson, they'd mobilized government officials, pulled decades-old records, constructed a narrative that made his concerns look like conspiracy theories. "I have documentation suggesting otherwise," he had said carefully. "You have the paranoid notes of an old man who spent 40 years alone," Patterson had replied. Silas Nix was known to be mentally unstable in his later years. His documentation has no legal weight. The soil samples will tell us what's true. The soil samples you collected without proper chain of custody, without certified testing equipment, without following any scientific protocol. Patterson's smile had been cold. "Those samples are worthless, Mr. Nix. Any contamination they show could easily be argued as contamination you introduced during collection." He was right, and Grady knew it. They'd tried to do things properly, but without professional equipment and certified collectors, their samples could be challenged in court. "I want an independent environmental assessment done," Grady had said. "By all means," Chen had replied. "File a request with the State Environmental Office. We'll review it according to standard procedures. That review typically takes 6 to 8 months before any testing is authorized." 8 months. Plenty of time for evidence to disappear, for witnesses to forget, for the story to go cold. Grady had seen this game before. Use bureaucracy as a weapon, delay until everyone gives up and moves on. "In the meantime," Patterson had continued, "you're in violation of site access restrictions. These gentlemen are federal marshals. They're here to ensure you don't interfere with a sealed remediation site." The two hard-eyed men had moved closer, hands near their belts where badges and weapons would be. Not threatening exactly, but making their authority clear. "We're leaving," Grady had said. "Come on, June." "Wait." One of the marshals had held up a hand. "The samples you collected need to come with us. They're property of the remediation site. Those are my samples from my land. From a federally supervised environmental site. They need to be properly handled." The marshal had extended his hand, waiting. Grady had looked at the backpack, at the hours of work they'd put into documenting the site, at the evidence they'd collected. Then he'd looked at June, standing beside him, watching to see what he'd do. If he refused, they'd probably arrest him. Take the samples anyway. June would be alone, or worse, they'd use her as leverage, and all of it would be legal because Patterson had lined up the right paperwork and the right officials before they'd even arrived. But if he handed over the samples, they'd disappear, be destroyed or lost or tested by labs that would find exactly what they were paid to find. "Dad," June had said quietly. She'd pulled out her phone, holding it where only he could see the screen. On it, a video was playing, footage of them collecting samples, marking locations, documenting everything. She'd been recording the whole time, uploading it all to cloud storage in real time. They could take the physical samples. They couldn't take the documentation that those samples existed, where they'd come from, and what they represented. Grady had handed the backpack to the marshal. "Make sure those get tested properly." "They will be." The marshal had passed them to Chen, who'd loaded them into her sedan with the kind of care that suggested they'd never see daylight again. Patterson had stepped closer to Grady, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "You're going to lose this fight, Mr. Nix. Every agency, every official, every judge you might appeal to, they all exist within systems that Senator Hartwell has had 20 years to influence. You're not fighting one man. You're fighting an entire infrastructure built to protect people like him." "Then I guess I better get started," Grady had said. "For your daughter's sake, I hope you reconsider." Patterson had glanced at June. Young lady like her, bright future ahead. Shame if her father's crusade cost her scholarships, job opportunities, the kind of normal life every parent wants for their child. June had stepped forward before Grady could stop her. "My father is teaching me that some things matter more than a normal life. Like integrity. Like standing up for what's right even when it's hard. Those are the kind of lessons that matter." Patterson had studied her for a long moment, then turned back to Grady. "The offer stands. 150,000. Clean break. Fresh start. Otherwise, this gets very unpleasant for everyone involved. We'll manage." The vehicles had left, kicking up dust as they departed, taking with them the physical evidence Grady and June had spent hours collecting. But June had already pulled out her laptop from the truck, verifying that all the video documentation, photographs, and GPS data had uploaded successfully. "We still have everything that matters," she'd said. "The location, the documentation, proof that we tried to collect samples and were prevented by officials who showed up suspiciously fast." Grady had pulled out his phone, looking at the message from Emma Wade again. Time to make this call. Time to bring the victims' families into this fight, because they deserved to know what had been hidden from them for 45 years. He dialed the number, and Emma had answered on the second ring. "Mr. Nix, this is Emma Wade." "Ms. Wade, thank you for reaching out. I know this must be—" "My father was 28 when he died. I was 6 months old. I never knew him except through photographs and my mother's stories." Her voice was steady but carried an edge of emotion held carefully in check. "Your letter said you have evidence about what really happened. I need to know if that's true." "It's true. I have documentation showing the company knew about equipment failures and ignored safety warnings. I have proof they paid people to cover it up. And I have a letter from my uncle, who was involved in that cover-up, confessing everything and asking for forgiveness." Silence on the line then. "Can I see it, all of it?" "Yes. But you should know that powerful people don't want this information public. They're going to fight to keep it buried." "Let them fight. My mother died 5 years ago, still believing my father's death was just a tragic accident. She never knew the truth, never had the chance to hold anyone accountable. I won't make the same mistake." Emma's voice had strengthened with conviction. "When can we meet?" Grady had looked at June, who nodded. "Tomorrow, I'll send you the address of where we're staying. And Miss Wade, thank you. Your father deserves justice. They all do." After the call ended, Grady had received 2 more messages. One from Matthew Jennings, Carl's son, asking to meet, and one from an investigative journalist named Maria Torres, who'd heard about his letters to the families and wanted to know more. The story was spreading, the truth was getting out, and while Patterson had resources and influence, Grady had something stronger, people who'd waited 45 years for answers and were finally going to get them. "What now?" June had asked. "Now we go back to the motel, organize everything we have, and prepare to meet with people who deserve to know what really happened." Grady had started the truck, feeling exhausted but determined. "Patterson thinks he can intimidate us into silence. Let's show him what happens when people who have nothing left to lose decide to fight back." They'd driven away from the property, leaving behind the cabin and the buried tank and the ghost of Silas Nix, keeping watch over secrets he'd finally found the courage to share. Behind them, the prairie stretched empty and vast under an endless sky. Ahead, justice waited. All they had to do was reach it. Emma Wade had arrived at the motel the next morning carrying a worn photo album and a manila folder thick with papers. She was in her early 50s, her father's eyes looking out from her face, and when she shook Grady's hand, her grip was firm with purpose. "My mother kept everything," she'd said, settling into one of the motel room chairs. "Every newspaper article, every letter from the company, every document from the investigation. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew something wasn't right about how fast everything got settled and closed. Grady had laid out Silas's journal, the inspection reports, the photographs from the well, all of it arranged chronologically. Emma had read through it methodically, her expression growing harder with each page. "They knew," she'd said finally, her voice tight. "They knew the equipment was failing, and they sent my father in there anyway." "Yes. And your uncle, he reported it, and they told him to keep quiet." "He did more than that," Grady had said gently. "He revised his report to downgrade the danger. He took money to stay silent. He was part of the cover-up. That's why he left this confession. He wanted you and the other families to know the truth." Emma had picked up the letter Silas had written, reading it completely. When she finished, tears were running down her face, but her voice stayed steady. At least he tried to make it right at the end. That's more than the others did. June had been quiet through most of this, sitting on the bed with her laptop. But now she'd spoken up. "There's something else. The land where it happened, it's contaminated. The company said they cleaned it up, but Uncle Silas tested it privately. The chemicals are still there. Can you prove that?" "We tried to collect samples yesterday," Grady had said, "but government officials showed up and confiscated them. They claimed the site was properly remediated in 1979 and sealed. But the timing was too convenient. They knew we were testing, and they stopped us." Emma had opened her manila folder, pulling out documents. "My mother hired a lawyer in 1979 to investigate. He was young, eager, thought he could take on Hartwell Energy. He found irregularities in the company's remediation reports, dates that didn't match, invoices for work that seemed insufficient for the scope they claimed. But before he could file anything, the State Environmental Office issued a certification saying the site was clean. Case closed. Do you still have those reports?" "Copies of everything." The lawyer gave up after that, said there was nothing he could do if the state certified the cleanup. But my mother never believed it. Emma had handed the folder to Grady. "She used to drive out to that property every year on the anniversary of my father's death, just to stand there, to remember. She said it never felt right, that place. Said it felt like something was still wrong there." Grady had gone through the documents carefully. The lawyer's notes detailed discrepancies in remediation costs, questions about disposal methods, concerns about monitoring data that seemed too perfect. All of it dismissed once the state issued its certification. "This gives us leverage," he'd said. "If we can show the original cleanup was rushed or falsified, we can demand new testing." "How?" Before Grady could answer, there was a knock at the door. Matthew Jennings had arrived, Carl's son, now 47 years old, with his father's broad shoulders and serious expression. And with him, to Grady's surprise, was Maria Torres, the investigative journalist. "I hope you don't mind," Matthew had said. "Ms. Torres contacted me after you wrote. She's been researching Hartwell Energy for years." Torres had been younger than Grady expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a recorder already in her hand. "I've been following Senator Hartwell's career for a decade. He's clean on the surface, but there are patterns. Campaign contributions from energy companies. Votes that favor industry over regulation. I've always suspected his background held something worth hiding, but I could never prove it." "Until now," Grady had said. "Until now." Torres had set her recorder on the table. "Here's what I propose. You give me access to everything. Documents, photos, testimony, all of it. I write the story, publish it in outlets that can't be pressured to kill it. Once it's public, the pressure shifts. Instead of you fighting to be heard, they have to fight to defend themselves." Emma had looked at Grady. "Can she be trusted?" "I've been investigating corporate malfeasance for 15 years, Torres had said. "I've taken on oil companies, pharmaceutical manufacturers, defense contractors. I've been sued, threatened, had my car vandalized. But I've never killed a story because someone didn't like the truth. If you give me this, I will tell it, all of it. I promise you that. Grady had thought about Patterson's offer. The money, the clean break, the safe path. Then he'd looked around the room. At Emma holding her father's photo album, at Matthew with his father's determined expression, at June watching him to see what kind of man he would choose to be. "We're in," he'd said. "All of it. Everything we have." Torres had smiled. "Then let's bring them down." They'd spent the next 4 hours going through everything methodically. Torres had recorded interviews with Emma and Matthew, both of them describing their fathers, their families, the decades of questions that had never been answered. She'd photographed every document, verified details, built a timeline that showed not just the accident, but the systematic cover-up that followed. By early afternoon, Torres had enough for multiple articles. "This is bigger than I thought. This isn't just about one accident. This is about a pattern of corporate negligence enabled by government officials who should have been protecting workers." "When can you publish?" Emma had asked. "I need a week to verify some details, get comments from the principals, though I doubt Hartwell or Patterson will talk. But once I file, it'll go live within 24 hours. Torres had packed up her materials carefully. "One thing you should know. The moment this publishes, you're all going to be targets. Legal threats, media scrutiny, people digging into your lives looking for anything to discredit you. Are you prepared for that?" "My father died 46 years ago," Emma had said. "I've been waiting my whole life to know why. Let them come." "My dad spent his childhood without a father," Matthew had added. "I spent mine without a grandfather to teach me the things fathers teach sons. Whatever they throw at us, it's nothing compared to what was taken from us." Torres had turned to Grady. "And you? You're the one with the most to lose. You've got your daughter to think about." Grady had looked at June, and she'd nodded once, firm and certain. "We're all in," he'd said. "Publish the story." After Torres and the victims' families left, Grady and June had sat in the quiet motel room, processing everything that had just happened. In a week, the story would break. The cover-up would be exposed. 45 years of silence would end. "You think Uncle Silas would be proud?" June had asked. "I think he'd be grateful and relieved." Grady had picked up the confession letter, reading it one more time. He spent his whole life wishing someone would be brave enough to do what he couldn't. Now, someone is. "Dad." "Yeah? Whatever happens next, I'm glad we did this. I'm glad you didn't take the money." Grady had moved to sit beside her, pulling her into a hug. "Me too, Junebug. Me too." Outside, the sun was setting over Oklahoma, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. Somewhere out there, Senator Dale Hartwell, Jr. was going about his day, unaware that his carefully constructed political career was about to come crashing down. Richard Patterson was probably congratulating himself on securing the soil samples, thinking he'd won. They had no idea what was coming, and Grady found himself looking forward to the moment they found out. The week before publication had been tense. Torres had called daily with updates and verification questions. She'd contacted Senator Hartwell's office for comment and been told by his press secretary that the senator had no knowledge of any environmental or safety issues from his brief time in private industry decades ago. She'd reached out to Richard Patterson, who'd responded with a 2-page letter threatening legal action if any defamatory claims were published. "That's how you know we've got them," Torres had said when she called to read Grady the letter. "They're scared." On the 6th day, Torres had called with unexpected news. "I found Robert Sullivan's fiancée. Well, his former fiancée. Her name is Catherine Morrison now. She's been living in Texas for the past 40 years. What did she say? She wants to meet you. Said she's kept Bobby's things all these years. Letters he wrote. Plans they made. She never married, never really moved on. Said she's been waiting for someone to care enough to find out what really happened." Grady had driven to Texas the next day. June beside him, to meet a woman who'd spent 45 years in a kind of suspended animation, her future buried in 1978 alongside the man she was supposed to marry. Catherine Morrison had been 70 years old, still beautiful despite the years, with eyes that carried a sadness so deep it seemed to have become part of her. She'd greeted them at her small home in Austin, invited them in, served coffee she'd prepared carefully. Bobby was 22, she'd said, showing them photographs. A young man with dark hair and a bright smile, usually wearing work clothes, sometimes dressed up for dates. He was studying engineering at night, working the Hartwell site during the day to pay for school. He wanted to design safety equipment, wanted to make work sites safer. The irony of how he died, it would have destroyed him to know he was right, that the equipment really was dangerous. She'd pulled out a box of letters, love letters written in careful handwriting. He wrote to me about the problems at work, how worried he was about the tanks, how the supervisors kept telling them everything was fine when he could see it wasn't. His last letter came 3 days before he died. Catherine had handed it to Grady, and he'd read it aloud so June could hear. "Dearest Catherine, I'm probably worrying over nothing, but I wanted to tell you about something that's bothering me. One of the old-timers here, Silas Nix, put in reports about pressure issues with the big tanks. Management shot him down, said everything's within specs. But Silas knows what he's doing, and if he's worried, I'm worried. I talked to him today, asked if I should be concerned. He looked at me like he wanted to say something but couldn't. Then he just said, 'Be careful, kid. Watch yourself around Tank 7. I don't know what that means, but I trust Silas. He's one of the good ones. I'll keep my eyes open and stay alert. Don't worry about me. 12 more months and I'll have enough saved for school. Then it's 2 years to my degree, and then you and I can start our real life together. I can't wait to marry you, Catherine. I love you more than I can say. Yours always, Bobby." The room had gone silent when Grady finished reading. Catherine had tears running down her face, and June wasn't far behind. "He died 8 days after he wrote that," Catherine had said quietly. "Tank 7 ruptured during his shift. He was standing right next to it. They said it was instant, that he didn't suffer. I've never known if that was true or just something they told me to make it easier." "I'm sorry," Grady had said, the words feeling completely inadequate. "Are you really going to expose what they did? Make them answer for it?" "Yes. A journalist is publishing the story tomorrow. Everything we found, everything Silas documented. The whole truth." Catherine had smiled then, sad but genuine. Bobby would have liked that. He believed in doing things right, in standing up for what mattered. That's who he was. She'd gathered the letters carefully. "I want you to have these. For your journalist friend. Let people know who Bobby was. Not just another accident statistic, but a real person with dreams and plans, and someone who loved him." Grady had taken the letters with reverence, understanding the gift she was giving. These were her most precious possessions, 45 years of kept promises to a man who never came home, and she was trusting him to honor them. "I'll make sure she tells his story right," Grady had promised. They'd returned to Oklahoma that evening, and Grady had immediately scanned and sent the letters to Torres. She'd called within an hour, her voice thick with emotion. "These are perfect. They humanize everything, show that these weren't just workers. They were people with futures that got stolen from them." She'd paused. "The story goes live tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. I wanted you to know first. Get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow's going to be intense." Grady and June had stayed up late, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. At midnight, Grady had received an email from Torres with the final article attached. "Thought you should see it before the world does?" Her message read. The headline, "The Hartwell Cover-Up, How 3 Workers Died, a Company Lied, and a Senator Built His Career on Buried Secrets." Grady had read it through twice. Torres had done exactly what she promised, told the whole truth, held nothing back, named names and provided documentation for every claim. It was devastating, thorough, and impossible to dismiss. "It's perfect," June had said, reading over his shoulder. "Yeah, it is." At 5 a.m., Grady had given up on sleep and made coffee. June had joined him, both of them watching the clock count down to 6. At exactly 6 a.m., Torres's article went live simultaneously on 3 major news sites. By 6:15, it was trending on social media. By 6:30, television news was picking it up. By 7, Grady's phone was ringing with media requests. The story was out. The truth was spreading, and there was no taking it back. 3 months later, Grady and June stood at the property line of what everyone was now calling the Hartwell site. Fall had arrived on the Oklahoma prairie, painting the grassland in shades of gold and rust. The cabin still stood, barely, but it looked different now. Cleaner, somehow, less burdened. The aftermath of the article's publication had been exactly as intense as Torres had predicted. Senator Hartwell had held a press conference the same day, denying everything while simultaneously announcing he wouldn't seek re-election due to health concerns. Patterson had issued legal threats that went nowhere once the FBI opened an investigation. The State Environmental Office had been forced to commission new testing of the site, which confirmed everything Silas's private tests had shown. The contamination was real. The cover-up was real. And 45 years later, justice was finally being served. Emma Wade had called that morning with news. The families reached a settlement, not just us. They found 12 other workers who'd been exposed to contamination over the years and developed health problems. Hartwell's estate is paying $40 million total. It'll never bring our fathers back, but at least their deaths aren't being covered up anymore. Matthew Jennings had started a foundation in his father's name to advocate for workplace safety regulations. Catherine Morrison had attended the first fundraiser, bringing Bobby's letters to display, making sure people remembered who these men had been. The property itself had been designated a Superfund site. Proper remediation would take years and cost millions, but it would be done right this time. No one would ever build houses here. No children would ever play in contaminated soil. Silas's 45 years of guardianship had finally been relieved by the only thing that could, the truth. Grady had declined most media requests, but he'd agreed to one interview with Torres, where he'd read portions of Silas's confession letter on camera. The response had been overwhelming. Messages from across the country, people sharing their own stories of workplace accidents and corporate cover-ups, thanking him for having the courage to speak up. But it was the message from Sarah, Silas's long-ago girlfriend, that had hit hardest. She'd written to say she'd read about everything, had always suspected Silas carried secrets too heavy to share. "I loved him," she'd written, "but he couldn't love me back while he was drowning in guilt. I'm glad he finally found a way to tell the truth, even if he couldn't do it while he was alive. Tell him I understand. Tell him I forgive him." Grady had read that letter at Silas's grave, a simple marker in a county cemetery where they'd moved him from the pauper's field. Emma, Matthew, and Catherine had attended the reburial, along with descendants of the other families affected by the accident. They'd planted 3 trees nearby, one for each man who died, with plaques bearing their names. They mattered, Emma had said during the small ceremony. The truth mattered. Someone finally said so. Now, standing at the property with June on a crisp October morning, Grady felt a sense of completion that had eluded him since inheriting this place. The land itself would never be his to develop or sell. It was too contaminated for that. But in a way, that felt right. Some places should be left empty, kept as reminders of what happens when profit takes precedence over human life. "What are you thinking about?" June asked. She'd changed over these past months. Grown taller somehow, though that might have just been the confidence she carried now. She'd started speaking up more in school, had joined the debate team, was talking about studying environmental law in college. The quiet, withdrawn girl had transformed into someone with purpose and voice. "I'm thinking about inheritance," Grady said. "What it really means." "What does it mean?" "I used to think it was about what you leave behind. Money, property, things with value. But Silas taught me different. He left me 40 years of guilt and a choice about what to do with it. That was his real inheritance. Not the land or the money in that box, but the opportunity to be braver than he was." June had moved closer, taking his hand. "You were brave, Dad. You could have taken the money and walked away. Nobody would have blamed you. You would have known, though. That's what mattered." Grady had squeezed her hand gently. "I wanted you to see that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something, that's what builds a life worth living. That's the inheritance I want to leave you." "You already have," June said quietly. "I'll never forget watching you choose truth over safety. Watching you stand up to people who had more power and money and influence. You showed me what courage looks like." They'd stood in silence for a while, watching the grassland sway in the constant prairie wind. Somewhere beneath their feet, Tank 7 still lay buried, but now everyone knew it was there. The danger was marked, documented, contained. It would be cleaned up properly, finally, after nearly half a century. Grady had gotten a new trucking job, regional routes that kept him home most nights. The pay was decent, the work steady. They'd found a small house to rent in Oklahoma City, near Ellen, but with their own space. June was thriving in her new school. Life was simpler than it had been, but richer too. "Ready to go?" June asked. "Yeah. Let's go home." They'd walked back to the truck together, leaving behind the cabin and the land and the ghosts of choices made long ago. As they drove away, Grady had looked in the rear-view mirror one last time at the property that had changed everything. He thought about Silas, spending 45 years in self-imposed isolation, carrying guilt that grew heavier with each passing day. Thought about 3 men who'd gone to work one morning and never came home. Thought about families who'd waited decades for truth that almost never came. But it had come, finally, because one man had been weak enough to feel guilt, careful enough to preserve evidence, and brave enough, at the very end, to pass that burden to someone who might carry it differently. Some inheritances arrived wrapped in pretty paper with clear instructions. Others came as rusty boxes hidden under floorboards, containing nothing but questions and moral weight. Grady had received the second kind, and in accepting it, in choosing to honor it rather than ignore it, he'd discovered something about himself he hadn't known before. He was the kind of man who could stand up when it mattered. The kind of father who taught by example rather than words. The kind of person who understood that some things, truth, justice, integrity, were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. June had fallen asleep in the passenger's seat as they drove, her head resting against the window. Grady had glanced over at her, this remarkable daughter who'd stood beside him through everything, and felt a surge of fierce pride. Whatever challenges came next, and life would surely bring more, they'd face them together, with honesty, with courage, with the knowledge that doing right mattered more than doing easy. That was the real inheritance Silas had given them. Not land or money, but the opportunity to be better than circumstances suggested they had to be. And looking at his sleeping daughter, knowing the woman she was becoming, Grady thought maybe that was worth more than any cabin or cash could ever be. The prairie stretched endlessly behind them as they drove toward home, toward whatever future they'd build together. The past had finally been put to rest. The truth had finally been told. 3 men who died too young had finally been remembered for more than just accident statistics. In the end, Grady thought, that mattered. That meant something. Sometimes the smallest inheritance carries the greatest weight, not in what it gives you, but in who it asks you to become. Silas had been too afraid to be that person, but he'd found someone who wasn't, and that made all the difference.